Ross Wilson comes from Great Britain. He's...
That always happens after someone says my name. So,
okay. Yeah. His research interests are history, theory and practice of literary criticism, romanticism, etc. He's the author of the book on Adorno, which I actually read. He's the author of a book on Shelley and apprehension of life, editor of Meaning of Life, which is very promising, and subjective universality in Kant's aesthetics, which is okay. So Ross, the podium is yours. The title of your presentation is Alienation and the Alien, Adorno in the Ferment of Dialectics. So.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I feel that going on the last day, of course, the presence of every paper that I've heard in the last couple of days kind of weighs on this paper in some ways. So you'll hear a lot of connection, or I hope you'll hear a lot of connections with things that others have said, sort of references to Heidegger and Lukács through this paper, and of course to Adorno's Minima Moralia that we heard about from Nadezhda yesterday. Is this too loud? I have quite a loud voice, so this is okay. Good. Okay. So toward the end of the call for papers for this conference, the organisers ask the intriguing question, should we propose in praise of alienation? And this paper is offered as a kind of answer to this question, even if it stops short of praising alienation as such. And I want to trace the concept of alienation through the work of Theodor Adorno, not all the way through it, don't worry, but in particular in Minima Moralia, about which, as I've said, Nadezhda spoke yesterday, and in his late reflective masterpieces, Negative Dialectics and Aesthetic Theory. And Minima Moralia, of course, was written while Adorno had been forcefully alienated from his own native land and was living as an alien, indeed as an enemy alien, first briefly in the United Kingdom and then in Los Angeles County, California. Now, one needn't be overly given to biographical readings in order nevertheless to discern in Adorno's later thinking a significant intellectual sympathy with the alien and, importantly, a determination to reserve a place for it in an intellectual and social formation rid of the menace of alienation itself. If there is little overt affirmation of alienation in Adorno's work, that is, there is nevertheless a place, a home, one might almost go so far as to say, for the alien. And I want to think a little bit about the category of home as well in Adorno's work. Now, I'm conscious that this turn to Adorno that I want to take in this paper may seem to some, many perhaps, a retrograde step. Axel Honneth, for example, opens his foreword to Rahel Jaegi's book Alienation with a telling off for Adorno, as well as for Marcuse and Horkheimer, for the essentialism and generalization that their concept of alienation apparently betrayed. And Jaegi's book itself, by the way, only mentions Adorno once in a footnote characterizing the unavoidable ambivalence of the concept of false life, again, as touched upon by Nadezhda yesterday. The concept of alienation, declares Honneth, a product of modernity through and through, presupposes for Rousseau no less than for Marx and his heirs a concept of the human essence, and this is what he objects to in Adorno. Now, I don't happen to agree with Honneth's account, no surprise there, but more constructively, I hope, than just avowing my dissent from it, I want to take up the historical claim to the thoroughgoing modernity of the concept of alienation that Honneth makes here in a moment. But in order to get there, so to speak, I want to start with a passage from around the middle of the second section of Negative Dialectics, where Adorno returns to a motif that characterized his work throughout his career. Describing a thoughtless rationality, thoughtless is the translation in the deeply imperfect Ashton translation, so besinnungslose is the German term. So senseless rationality, blinded to the point of madness by whatsoever eludes its rule. Adorno notes that this unhappy situation has consequences for the theory of alienation itself, and this is a quotation. Even the theory of alienation, the ferment of dialectics, confuses the need to approach the heteronomous and thus irrational world, to be at home everywhere, as Novalis put it, with the archaic barbarism that the longing subject cannot love what is alien and different, with the craving for incorporation and persecution. If the alien were no longer ostracized, there hardly would be any more alienation. The theory of alienation is the ferment of dialectics, because dialectics, as Adorno declares elsewhere in these early phases of the argument of negative dialectics, is the ontology of the wrong state of things, is itself the form of thinking that responds to the fact of alienation. Yet we can also detect here, I think, an intimation of the way that, if not alienation itself, then the alien can break this spell cast by its opposite, identification, and the identity thinking by which it is, of course, underwritten. If dialectics is itself to ferment a change in the state of things, then it must move past the insistence that those things are reducible to a single and stable identity and must recover the alien in them. It is this intimation that I want, above all, to emphasize in this paper. But we must tarry first with this typically gnomic passage in order to do so. There are two dialectical pairings in it, for instance, that require comment. The first, and most glaring, arises in the insistence that the world is irrational because it is heteronomous. The charge of irrationality here must, of course, be taken in the context provided by the characterization just before of an overweening, intolerant, and finally senseless rationality. And Rationalität is always a suspect term, I think it's fair to say, in Adorno, in contrast to Vernunft. There's a reason. The need to approach such a world as distinct from the archaic and barbarous wish to dominate it can only be resolved in reconciliation with it, not mastery of it. Such a world would be revealed as rational insofar as reason at the same time recognizes the other than reason, the heteronomous within itself. Now, a perhaps more intractable pairing is that of incorporation, the German here is Einverleibung, and persecution, Verfolgung. Now, one quite subtle tension here arises from the static impulse of incorporation and the processual quality of Verfolgung, which can also mean hunting or pursuit, as well as legal process in a variety of alternative usages. Now, Einverleibung does have some administrative uses, akin to the English legal and corporate usage of the term by which it's translated here, incorporation, but the sense in this passage is one of assimilation, of consumption, even of eating. One might recall here, I think, Adorno's remark that if the lion had a consciousness, his rage at the antelope he wants to eat would be ideology. What is incorporated in order to overcome its resistance to incorporation is cast as recalcitrant, inimical, even as it is devoured as victim. And I'm tempted to note here, by the way, that Adorno's enraged lion is one member of a caste of modern talking or conscious animals that would include Wittgenstein's famous lion again, whom we would not understand even were he able to speak, and perhaps more pertinently, Nietzsche's birds of prey, who, in On the Genealogy of Morals, reply to the admonition that they should love the lambs that they devour by objecting that indeed they love nothing more than a nice, tender lamb. Now, Nietzsche's is the more pertinent comparator because his bird of prey is a different kind of ideologue from Adorno's would-be conscious lion, one who, rather than indulging rage at his victim, instead casts, however facetiously, his own deportment toward it as love. Now, be that as it may, like Nietzsche's invocation of the bird of prey, Adorno's lion rears its head in the course of a consideration of instinct, and in particular, the fundamental instinct of self-preservation. The lion's externally directed rage at the antelope is complemented by an internal turn of consciousness against itself, which the lion, of course, doesn't have, but if it did. In finding the world other and inimical, it reverts to self-preservation. Diese Wendung ist schon die zum falschen Bewusstsein, says Adorno. This turn is already that towards false consciousness. Now, what this detour via the birds of prey, lions, and antelopes of Nietzsche's and Adorno's imaginations fundamentally underlines is that the will to mastery and assimilation can never come to rest. What seeks to dominate the alien world can never itself be at home. And I was thinking here, as I was kind of reading over this morning, of Nathan's emphasis on process yesterday, in the process of separation, that kind of processual character to this. And I've touched just a moment ago on the distinction that Adorno advances in the passage quoting Novalis from Negative Dialectics, in which he argues the theory of alienation neglects between the need, bedürfnis, to approach the world and be at home everywhere in it, and the lust or craving, Gier, to incorporate and persecute what is found to be other. Now that distinction appears to have a historical character, so returning to this historical question here. Lust or craving is cast as archaic and barbarous. Need, not least through allusion to Novalis' celebrated description of the drive to be at home everywhere, as modern. And there's a weird quirk, incidentally, here in the English handling of this passage from Novalis. So trieb is Novalis' word here. And for some reason, this is so rarely translated as drive in the English translations, which is a shame, because I think that the relations between trieb and Gier and bedürfnis, drive, craving, and need are really important to consider, although I'm going to announce that and set them aside here. The drive to be at home everywhere is cast as modern, that is, in no small part thanks to its formulation by Novalis, the archetypal romantic critic of the depredations of modernity. Though, and this is just a kind of literary, intellectual, historical note, lest we're tempted to take Novalis as entirely emblematic of this particular intellectual formation, we might do well to recall Goethe's declaration in his Dichtung und Wahrheit that, and I quote, human nature is endowed with a particular tenacity and versatility, enabling it to overcome everything that it contacts or takes into itself, or, if the thing defies assimilation, at least to render it innocuous. And for the sake of convenience, by the way, I'm using Harold Bloom's quotation of this passage from the Anxiety of Influence, which is probably the place where most Anglophone readers encounter it, and also because I came here from a Harold Bloom conference on Monday. Bloom, though, kind of reads this as Goethe's straightforward assertion of the kind of overcoming impulse that I suppose was identified in him by Nietzsche, but I think it's testament to Bloom's complete lack of a sense of humour, that he ignores the fact that actually what Goethe is talking about here is his various kind of ailments and what it's like in drinking too much brandy. Goethe's joking. He's joking here, and Bloom just kind of misses that. But nevertheless, I think he's giving expression here to a different impulse to the one that Novalis is giving. That's the point that I'm seeking to underline here. So, however the matter of Novalis' representativeness stands, Adorno's intimation that the will to incorporate and persecute is archaic and the drive to be at home in the modern world is modern is real. Yet this apparent trajectory, by positing a history from archaic barbarism to the need to approach the universal other, seems to run the risk of violating Adorno's insistence later in Negative Dialectics that there is no universal history from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is one from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. Yet a further measure of ambivalence can be introduced into our reading of this passage, however, if we focus on the allusion to Novalis and its own trajectory in the course of early to mid-20th century critical thinking, a trajectory that in some ways may be taken to lead to Negative Dialectics itself. Now this trajectory involves two figures, Heidegger and Lukács, from whom Adorno himself became increasingly alienated. In The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, a major transitional work in his own career, Heidegger cites Novalis' remark in full. Philosophy is actually homesickness, the urge to be at home everywhere, before going on to introduce a distinction between poets and philosophers that he, of course, would come increasingly to question as his own career developed. Now, arising from his quotation of Novalis, Heidegger then asks some importantly historicizing questions. This is a quotation from Heidegger. Homesickness. Does such a thing still exist today at all? Has it not become an incomprehensible word, even in everyday life? Has not contemporary city man, the ape of civilization, long since eradicated homesickness? and homesickness as the very determination of philosophy. Now, before you start to worry that I'm determined to take you on a further tour through a kind of virtual safari park, I'm willing to leave Heidegger's ape of civilization to one side here, though it did, of course, attract the attention of the late Jacques Derrida in his The Animal Which Therefore I Am. Instead, what I want to note is how Heidegger focuses on Novalis's überall. The point of the drive to be at home is to be at home everywhere, and thus, in Heidegger's reading, to constitute the world as a whole without any remainder in it. Heidegger brings out the totalizing drive, not, of course, of Novalis, but of what Novalis says lies at the root of philosophy. It is useful to be reminded, I think, of Heidegger's emphasis on the whole in this context, since we must recall that, for Adorno, the whole is the false, as, we might add, is its synonym in Heidegger's account, the world. By my telling, that's about halfway through my time, and I'm about halfway through this talk, so you can rest easy. Good. But keep listening. In addition to emphasizing, then, that Novalis casts philosophy not just as the drive to be at home anywhere, but to be at home everywhere, what Heidegger also does is to historicize Novalis's own totalizing description of philosophy. The homesickness Novalis diagnoses, and the supposed cure for it, philosophy, that he does not prescribe but rather also diagnoses, is a distinctly modern one in Heidegger's retelling. As Derrida's picking up on the reference to the ape of civilization intimates, so I lied, I do want to come back to the ape, but anyway, it is a historicization that itself has significant archaizing tendencies. Humanity's most modern iteration, city man, is at the same time its most primal, the ape. And one might also stumble over how contemporary city man might have long since done anything at all. Wouldn't it be central to the definition of contemporary city man, not maybe that he was born yesterday, but certainly that he is made anew each moment, sloughing off his past and outmoded selves? And if that is the case, how could he really claim to have achieved anything long since? Conversely, if homesickness was really abolished long since, then wouldn't that mean that the singular achievement of contemporary city man was not particularly contemporary at all? These wrinkles in the historical trajectory of homesickness and the achievement of its overcoming are discernible as well in what, Heidegger notwithstanding, must have been the most resonant and influential historicization of the romantic conception of homesickness for Adorno, namely, that with which Lukács opens his theory of the novel, a work itself that, again, given Lukács' own development, seems ineluctably to belong to the past. I quote the opening paragraph of that work here. Many of you will know this. Happy or blessed are those ages when the starry sky is the map of all possible paths, ages whose paths are illuminated by the light of the stars. Everything in such ages is new and yet familiar, full of adventure and yet their own. The world is wide and yet it is like a home, for the fire that burns in the soul is of the same essential nature as the stars. The world and the self, the light and the fire are sharply distinct, yet they never become permanent strangers to one another, for fire is the soul of all light, and all fire clothes itself in light. Thus each action of the soul becomes meaningful and rounded in this duality, complete in meaning and sense, and complete for the senses. Rounded because the soul rests within itself, even while it acts. Rounded because its action separates itself from it, and, having become itself, finds a centre of its own and draws a closed circumference round itself. Philosophy is really homesickness, says Novalis. It is the urge to be at home everywhere, and that's how he concludes that paragraph. In introducing it, I described this passage as a historicization of the sense that philosophy is homesickness, the drive to be at home everywhere. And of course, that is what it is. Lukács begins the theory of the novel this way because he wants, like every other theorist of the novel before him, to give an account of the historical ground for the novel's emergence in modernity. Yet the opening paragraph itself does not declare that those happy ages in which the starry sky is the map of all possible paths and everything is new and yet familiar are past, or indeed that they have ever been. It doesn't say that. Now, I promise not to weary everyone anymore. I promise not to weary those of you who might not delight in the minor controversies of literary history, and to leave the romantic nexus announced by Adorno's allusion to Novalis behind. However, I find as I start to bring this paper to its conclusion a number of steps that we must return to it one last time. Novalis declares that philosophy is really homesickness, which he glosses then as the drive to be at home everywhere. But is that drive, the drive to be at home everywhere, really what homesickness is? The drive to be at home everywhere sounds more like the billionaire's compulsive accumulation of pied-à-terre in every capital city and luxury beach resort than it does the exile's yearning for the home that they have lost. Home is particular, not general. If it is everywhere, it is nowhere. I suggested earlier that translators of Novalis' dictum don't seem to want to reach for the most obvious translation of trieb, drive, for some reason. The serious point here is that the differences, such as we may be able to account for them, between Novalis' trieb and need and gear are surely significant, as I said earlier. And when Adorno wrote Negative Dialectics in the late 60s, the sense was already stirring that the drive to be at home everywhere may well be on the verge of a kind of terrible fulfillment. The vapor trail mistaken for the cloud, the microplastics on the summit of Everest, the Pacific garbage patch, the transformation of the Earth's primeval forests into feedlots and mines have only heightened this sense. Senseless rationality is everywhere, but nowhere finds itself at home, since, so far, its only way of assimilating the only home it has ever had has been to destroy it. Adorno's project is not, however, an irrationalist one. It is not predicated on the exposure of rationality as always and everywhere besinnungslos, senseless. Compromised, partial and speculative as it is, the project is rather to try to envisage a rationality that would not be predicated on the destruction of its others and ultimately, therefore, of itself. Notoriously, for sure, one of the refuges Adorno identified for the shards of possibility that things might be otherwise was the artwork, and in particular, the artworks of high modernism. Central to Adorno's late unfinished aesthetic theory is Hegel's view in his aesthetics that the human being engages in the creation of artworks, and I quote, in order as a free agent to strip the external world of its inflexible foreignness and to enjoy in the shape of things only an external realization of himself. Aesthetic theory is a text in which alienation, and specifically the distinction between the alien and alienation, recurs again and again, and it's that latter in particular that I'm interested in. In his account of expression, both, that is, expression as a feature of artworks at different historical periods, and expression as what lends its name to a particular ism of the early 20th century, Adorno returns to the broad historical framing of the problem of alienation. Though unlike in the passage quoting Novalis from Negative Dialectics, here the archaic or rudimentary appears not as the site of an at once terrified and aggressive drive to alienate, but rather as what has been alienated. This is a quotation. What establishes itself in the artwork as an alien and rudimentary fetish that endures in opposition to the subject is, Adorno asserts, the plenipotentiary of the non-alienated. By contrast, however, what comports itself in the world as though it were unidentical nature is reduced all the more surely to the material of the domination of nature, to a vehicle of social domination, and is thus truly alienated. Here is the sense familiar from Adorno's late work that the artwork is the redoubt of resistance to the subject, to the world. And that sense is coupled with a matching, one might almost say inversely proportional, suspicion of whatever in the world comports itself as if it had escaped the web of identity. The tendency of the late Adorno to assign hope for resistance to art has received plenty of criticism, and I don't offer a response particularly to that here. But in Adorno's telling, the artwork shelters what, abroad in the world, would be wholly subject to alienation, so the domination that the subject inflicts on the irrational and heteronomous nature. And this really is turning towards the conclusion. Home, then, home is where you might be alien, but without being the object of alienation. The recursive structures of identity that characterize the cliches, at least in English, by which home is frequently celebrated, from the saccharine "Home Sweet Home" of a million needlework samplers, to Rudyard Kipling's menacing "East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet," are false. Home is not the fairy tale castle of the cannibalistic giant identity. Something like these intuitions about a home shorn of its exclusive menace is given articulation in what is, on first reading at least, a couple of troubling aphorisms in Adorno's Minima Moralia. I alluded briefly above to Adorno's status as an alien in the United Kingdom, and specifically in Oxford, where he was briefly enrolled as a doctoral student at Merton College. And the role of biographical context, and in particular the precise nature of its relation to subjective experience in Minima Moralia, is a vital, if difficult, question, as is the biographical question in general in relation to Adorno's career. On the one hand, his personal historical circumstances centrally structure his authorship and are thematized throughout Minima Moralia in particular. On the other hand, defenders of Adorno have wished to turn away from consideration of his actions in relation to the Studentbewegung, preferring instead to concentrate on the suggestive contrarian texts he produced in response to that movement at the very end of his life. I don't wish to confront that question here rather than to invoke it, as Adorno himself does in the two aphorisms that explicitly confront the question of race in Minima Moralia, both of which are, I think, both ahead of their time and deeply troubling. In Savages Are Not More Noble, a play, of course, on Rousseau, but also another instance of Adorno's awkward usage of the term savages, Wilden, to refer to members of non-Western societies, Adorno does at least allude to his experience of Oxford, noting how Siamese at Oxford, along with African students of political economy and diligent art historians and musicologists of petty bourgeois origins, I suspect I myself come close to belonging to this category, are all too ready to align themselves with the traditions to which they do not belong. They have, he says, an alarming affinity to positivism, and there's no denying, I think, there's a kind of ring of odi profanum vulgus, etc., here. One must have tradition in oneself to hate it properly, he mordantly observes. But the aphorism that I want to consider a bit more fully in, you'll be glad to hear, really my conclusion now, mélange, goes still further in its refusal of yet another version of the cheerful celebration of equality. What both of these aphorisms, so Savages Are Not More Noble and Mélange, have in common, that is a repudiation of the latent affirmation of sameness, and hence of the domination of a unitary standard that is central to the liberal avowal of equality. Mélange is Adorno's major statement against liberal assimilationism and the bland universalism on which it rests, and thus, for what it's worth, gives the lie to Honnet's description of the alleged universalism of Adorno, Marcuse et al. That I quoted at the beginning. Adorno opens Mélange by pointing out that cheerful approval of one race can easily coincide with the deepest prejudice against another. And he goes on to note that attempts to overcome the category of race altogether, a confected and divisive category to be sure, but one with which we are historically saddled, usually misfire. The most compelling anthropological proofs, he says, that the Jews are not a race will, in the event of a pogrom, scarcely alter the fact that the totalitarians know full well whom they do and whom they do not intend to murder. This is a prescient argument, I think, that has found echoes, for instance, in Toni Morrison's similar objection to white race blindness, that it is just when non-white races discover a racial consciousness for themselves that liberal whites discover that race was an illusory category all along. And most recently, in John Lanchester's observation that the fact that it is illegal to gather statistics on race in France, supposedly an anti-racist law, is hardly working out too well in the banlieue. The police always know who they're going to shoot. Working his way past the wrong turns of liberal assimilationism then, Adorno announces one of the stark wishes for a just society that punctuate minima moralia, others being, for example, that no one shall go hungry anymore, and that there shall be perpetual peace. This is the one he announces in Mélange, and is with this its avowal that, as I take it, home is where you are an alien, that I want to conclude. An emancipated, and this is the quotation then, that's the end. An emancipated society would not be a unitary one, but the realization of universality in the reconciliation of differences. Politics that are still seriously concerned with such a society ought not, therefore, propound the abstract equality of men even as an idea. Instead, they should point to the bad equality today, the identity of those with interests in films and weapons, and conceive the better state, Zustand, as one in which people could be different without fear. Thank you.
Interesting presentation. So, Nadezhda, please.
It was clear exposition, and I envy you the way you do it. Well, I have a lot of questions, and I'm not going to monopolize the discussion. I mean, I think the point of the Novalis quotations is what is Heimweh in Novalis? It's the experience of being displaced. It's what happens. That's the romantic experience. Mm-hmm. You don't have a home anymore. That's why they introduce fragments and history. And then, of course, some of them, Novalis died too young to do it. They try to heal it. They go to Christianity or Europe, whatever they do. That's and some of them, in sharing, you have identity politics. They try to, in the early sharing, where they have the work of art as an organon of philosophy. The art is doing things philosophy can't do, at least at the early sharing, things like that. And Adorno, in this sense, is repeating the gesture of knowing that there's no access to the whole, the Ganze so well. And there, of course, you can do it deal with it in different kinds of things. So, but I have just one sentence. If we go to the very method of dialectics, it's a self-consciousness of the objective context of delusion. That's the English translation. It doesn't sound quite right for me. I don't know. That's the type. And it, of course, has all kinds of ties. We could now discuss the Heidegger-Adorno similarities. That was people enjoyed that in Germany a few decades ago.
Sure.
They're trying to see that really they do what they do in a parallel. But Marxists then always asked, does negative dialectics have a take on the old questions? Do we deal with a false consciousness of a real state or a real consciousness of a false state? That's the Marxist way of trying to deal. No, I think it's extremely relevant still. But I think that you should stress the Heimweh thing is an experience of trying to heal something, the redemption, the not being able to. I think that's the fundamental experience of Romanticism, of the early Romanticism at least. Yeah. And there's the possibility of evoking Novalis when you don't want to have a system anymore or whatever.
Sure. Thank you. That's a very rich comment. I suppose what I wanted to emphasize in the reading of Novalis is that it seems that in many ways the function that that quotation serves in Heidegger and perhaps also in Lukács is that it's as if
The times when we had the unity, we don't have it anymore.
sure.
Less are the times
Well, so I suppose what I wanted to emphasise is that it's of course not as if Novalis is recommending philosophy. It's not a recommendation, and that his whole kind of writerly practice is of course intended to fragment these kind of totalizing efforts. But it becomes this. It appears that that's what he's recommending, and of course that's partly because, as you say, one of the impulses of early German Romanticism is to turn back to kind of fantasized versions of belonging. And I suppose the other thing that one might say and one might object is, well, it's better to be at home everywhere than, in fact, to be at home in one specific place, because another version of the kind of solution to this kind of homelessness is the origins of nationalism and so on. And so that kind of I know that that's the danger in saying that, well, home is particular, is to say, well, there's a certain kind of form there's a malevolent form that particularity can take, I think. So that was what I was trying to do in bringing that aspect out with Novalis. I suppose the other thing that I wanted, and this goes back to some of the things that we were talking about yesterday, in nostalgia, and the specific structure that takes with respect to in Adorno's work, is that he's deeply suspicious, of course, of those conservative moves to kind of invoke and to turn back to a fantasized past in which we are healed. And indeed, the whole language of healing and redemption and so on assumes that there is a kind of prior wholeness in a way. And he doesn't believe that, I think. So it's a specific kind of historicization that he's seeking to articulate in this case. Thank you.
Ross, thank you for this brilliant talk. I have two interconnected questions, I believe. But I would like to just start with a very short metaphor that just came into my mind. During your talk, I was observing a bird, or what was it? A butterfly, but it reminded me on a bird. And isn't this window a perfect metaphor for European Union? We have those birds, I forgot what's the name of those. How?
They're birds of prey. I suppose
yes.
they're here in Nietzsche's birds
Who
of prey.
Are
right?
here in the name of protection of the little birds by scaring them, and the fence is invisible. But somebody told me that on Tuesday there was a little birdie that crashed into the window and died. So this is the metaphor. But the question is, so how do you relate this Adorno's times and East-West story of that time to today's, maybe to Nathan's talk as well, to today's situation of, I don't know, global North, global South, question of migrants, of course, migrations, homelessness, and so on. This is one question. The other, which is also connected to this, is the question of time. Timelessness? I don't know if this exists. Thank you. Temporality or timelessness. Processuality, history within the very idea of alienation through, I don't know, through what you just, yeah. So this is it.
So yeah, thank you. Let me take the first question first, and I hadn't of course, I'd noticed these. We had them in England as well, of course, to do exactly the same thing. But I'd forgotten them when I was thinking about Nietzsche and his birds of prey and so on and so forth. So I'm going to answer that bit of your question by making reference to the wonderful aphorism in Minima Moralia about zoos. So it's not that I'm obsessed with animals. Sorry, I seem in kind of keeping apologising for this. Actually, I suppose it was a serious point. So in keeping apologising for kind of turning to the animal, I suppose there's this kind of sense that the consideration of the animal is kind of trivial. It wasn't for Adorno, I think, and the conception of the zoo and the ways in which zoos are designed is important for him as something more than a metaphor, actually, in a way. It's because I suppose in kind of describing these things as metaphors, what we're saying is that, yeah, it's a bit like the European Union, but of course we know that it's not. But actually what he wants to insist, I think, is that there is a continuity between these windows and the silhouettes of the birds of prey and the political, geopolitical kind of formation of something like the European Union. What he says about zoos is that, well, and again, it's similar to what he wants to say about liberal assimilationism and the kind of good intentions of the assertion of equality, is that the more humane design of zoo, where the animals are kind of kept down in pits and there are no bars and things like that, just kind of reflects back to us the invisibility, precisely the invisibility of the kind of limitations by which we're hemmed in. And so something like that, I think, would be a kind of similar way of reading these windows. Now that allows me a segue, I think, into what I think I want to say in response to your second, in response to the second part of that question about contemporary situation, temporality, historical difference, and things like that. So Adorno is, of course, talking about zoo design in the middle of the 20th century. And these, in this wonderful kind of modern retrofitted building and so on and so forth, here we are in the first quarter of the 21st century. In one sense, I think that it's vitally important, and Adorno would have said as well, it's vitally important to be attuned to the significant historical differences between our epoch and his, for instance, between the period of the kind of high Cold War. So Gregor and I were talking yesterday, we were born 19 days apart, and that kind of sense of the 1980s, the confrontation between these two kind of enormous nuclear-armed blocks and so on, and the differences in the formation of that between then and our world, but also to the continuities between that and now. I mean, it's a very simple point in some way, and I was talking with Nathan yesterday as we were walking back. The sense in which the climate crisis, for instance, is kind of coming down the road, absolutely, there are kind of tipping points that we've not yet reached, but also we are already there in many ways. So a lot of the things that he was describing are already features of our world. And the insistence on kind of antagonism between states, which is necessary to kind of capitalist accumulation and competition, is continuous with the historical circumstances that we have supposedly superseded, but actually haven't. And so I think concentration on that as well is important, is why a figure like Adorno continues, I think, to be significant. And I used, when I first started reading Adorno, to be rather dismissive in some ways of the importance of, the kind of crotché question, what is living and what is dead in the thought of Adorno. And I wouldn't want to frame it like that, but actually I think prescience is an important criterion for reading an authorship such as his, and kind of continued relevance in that sense. Does that go some way to? Yeah,
thank you so much. Okay. I was just wondering about the particular question of home, and homelessness, but we can talk about it.
Okay.
Back there, you hear many questions.
I mean, No, weirdly, I mean, I thought my question was wild, but Barra kind of asked the same thing. I was also want to talk about birds and animals and things, but also the question of metaphor. Like, I think it was interesting that you were like kind of going for like talking about the lion and so on and the animals. And it seems to me like there's a kind of, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I was thinking that in psychoanalytic sense, this could be more like condensation than displacement, or in the Roland Barthes sense, it's more metaphor than metonymy. It seems to be like a certain way of thinking, and you were kind of approaching this in your answer to Barra's question, like a certain way of thinking that seeks for like metaphor rather than metonymy, or condensation rather than displacement. And I don't know if there's a peculiar kind of alienation or unhomeliness in this kind of thing, like thinking metaphorically is actually a kind of alienation. I don't know if there's metaphoric and metonymic alienation, but it made me think maybe there is, and that there's certain kind of thinking which is grasping for this kind of particular form of unhomeliness that is the metaphorical alienation. So anyway, I don't know if you want to say more about metaphor or animals or what, but it's something about that interested me.
I don't want to say anything more about animals. It's a very good question. And extremely suggestive, so thank you for it. I'm not sure if I have a particularly insightful response at this stage, other than to point to what everyone knows already, so the idea of metaphor as a kind of carrying across and transit in that sense. So from one thing to another has the way of thinking of something as different from itself built into it naturally. So it's very suggestive from that point of view. And other than just that, to underline the fact that, you know, I'm deeply committed to the sense in which the sometimes kind of irritating figurative flourishes in a thinker like Adorno are not detachable from the actual content, kind of summarizable content of his thought, which is why perhaps people with kind of literary training, you know, like him so much, and you know, but that I think I just want to take this opportunity to emphasize. But the specific question about the role of metaphor in thinking about the other and of alien, I think is really superbly suggestive. So thank you for that.
Okay. I thought that was a fantastic paper. Thanks so much. I guess this will be a question about method, but also one about maybe ontology, because it strikes me that just the intellectual historical context of Novalis's formulation is so important, maybe returning to elements of Nadezhda's question. So that is, we're between Kant and Hegel here, let's say, and you know, the Romantics are trying to get over the diremption, you know, let's say in the real introduced by Kantian philosophy without being Spinozist, something like that, you know. So that the context of this, there's a kind of anabasis, you know, I think, which is inscribed in Novalis's thinking here, where it's not just like to be at home everywhere means to like think in a sort of spatially totalizing manner, but to return to the source. Right, so even you can see in Kant like the division between the transcendental unity of apperception and the sort of temporality of the inner sense is a division of the subject. You know, in Fichte, the division between the I and the not I, and these problems, of course, stem into Schelling's identity thinking, etc. So the bare introduction of temporality into the subject is a kind of division that one wants to overcome and return to a kind of, not necessarily an ontological plenum, but something like a unity of being, you know, which is divided in the Kantian system. And anyway, so my point is, we're involved sort of halfway between the Kantian philosophy and the development of the dialectic. And what strikes me about Novalis is, well, first of all, I don't know that it's true that he's not recommending philosophy. I mean, I think he is. Think about the Allgemeine Brillion. You know, where we have his attempt to sort of think every possible like discipline and range of and find a form for doing that. So I guess my question would ultimately be then, what about the form of the fragment in relationship to this desire, this homesickness for, you know, a source that then looks for it everywhere in relation to the dialectic? Because it seems so important for, you know, this is maybe why the fragment became a deconstructive you know, sort of organon. Also, why La Coulabart and Jean-Luc Nancy were so attached to the Romantics, a form of non-dialectical thinking, which sort of proliferates,
Yeah.
you know, without a unity,
Yeah.
and how that might relate to Adorno's project of negative dialectics.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. And yes, I perhaps want to step back a little bit from my rather insistent, kind of claim that he's not necessarily recommending philosophy. I suppose what I meant by that was that he's not recommending the kind of systematic drive to kind of assert the at-homeness of the subject in that sense. But it seems that there is something, and I use this term very hesitantly, kind of totalizing in a way about the fragment, because there's always more than one of them. And so in that sense, the fragment is itself, I'm very given to concentrating on things as and thinking about their generic form. But when we think about the generic form of the fragment, we tend to take them in isolation, but they never come in isolation, as it were. And so in that sense, then, this kind of internally fragmented unity, if not totality, of something like Novalis's work, I do think is, an important sort of, if not step on the way to a kind of dialectical formation, then an alternative to it, whereby you can kind of think towards a whole without kind of positing it from the outset. But I think the plurality of the fragment needs to be taken into account along with its singularity, if you see what I mean. But I'm also acutely conscious that I need to know more about Novalis, as not perhaps as much as you do, but to kind of think about what specifically this holds out for Adorno. So other people like Andrew Barry and stuff have wanted to insist on early German Romanticism as, in some senses, the kind of ground for Adorno's thinking, and as kind of continuing that project. And I want to kind of take that seriously. So thank you, but yes, yeah.
Yeah, Ross, if I may, I'd
please.
like to continue with this discussion of the literary and artistic form, because these are the things that Adorno pays so much attention to. And so the classical examples would be someone like Schiller, right? The talk about naive and sentimental poetry would be another example of how, in fact, alienation is marked by a particular division, in poetic form. And then even someone like Lessing, the Laocoon, right? The way Lessing alerts us to the division between different sense perceptions of an artwork, right? So it seems to me that in the whole German Romantic tradition, as you speak about it, there is this heightened awareness, right, of precisely a kind of alienation, right? So alienation, in fact, has been turned into very effective modes of theorizing and philosophizing about form. Would you agree with that? And to that extent, I would say yes. Adorno seems to be continuing that way of thinking about sense perception and form, right? Yeah.
No, I think that's right, and I suppose in some senses Adorno's thinking about art comes back to this question of division that Nathan was talking about yesterday. Just with the Lessing as well, of course, what's at issue in the Laocoon is, again, temporality and time, and how that works differently in different art forms. But Adorno certainly, so this is a kind of philological kind of answer to that question, but in lieu of a more thoroughly thought out one. Adorno is very interested, isn't he, in the relationship of the different arts to one another, and also to the category of art as such. In one sense, then, continues precisely this kind of romantic and late romantic concern with just that question. So while it's very different from the treatment that gets in someone like Wagner, or even in Walter Pater in England, and Oscar Wilde and so on. There's a kind of continuity to think of, well, what does the kind of fragmented nature of this category art mean? And he wants to think as well quite specifically about modern artworks that seek not so much, as it were, to kind of bridge that gap, but to sort of advertise it, as it were, within their own form. So things like musical scores that appear as visual works of visual art, and of course his treatment, so as literature people, in one sense, his treatment of literature is organized right around that kind of conception that, well, the Sprachkunstwerk, as he calls it, tends towards a musical work or visual work at the same time, without actually kind of achieving this fulfillment. It's a kind of problem for Adorno that understanding, and so trying to understand Endgame, for instance, being, the understanding breaks down in modernist works, and that's not a kind of token of their fulfillment as kind of visual or musical works of art, but of the way in which they perhaps move towards them in that sense. Yeah, lovely question. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this discussion. I guess there's no questions anymore. But I will ask you one question, if you
go for it.
You quoted two passages from Minima Moralia.
Yeah.
It's the second part of your lecture, and one of them was related to the tradition. If I understand properly, Adorno tried to say that in order to hate properly tradition,
yeah,
you have to interiorize it properly.
Yeah.
So, and somehow you hinted that this is deeply disturbing in a way. For me, it is, because there's an elitism, etc.
Yeah.
You can hate properly if you are, the best, the most elite. So, but you didn't go into that.
No, sure. I suppose so. Just what I wanted to do by having that before us, or in our area, I suppose, was precisely to kind of advert to the deeply uncomfortable moments in Adorno's consideration of kind of non-high bourgeois culture and non-Western culture in Minima Moralia. But again, I suppose I would want here to make a similar point to the one I made in respect to the kind of literary style of Adorno's writing, which is that that's not separable from the point that he does want to make. So I find that way in which he opens that aphorism, "Savages are not more noble," deeply objectionable. But at the same time, the deep objectionableness of it is kind of the condition for him to be able to sort of announce what I kind of take to be true, which is that a proper hatred or critique or overcoming of tradition has to kind of come through it in that sense. And likewise, that way in which I take him to be arguing in the later aphorism that, of course, race is a kind of nonsense category. It doesn't, and it's not as if he thinks the most compelling anthropological proofs of the fact that the Jews are not a race aren't true. Of course, he has the highest respect for anthropological research and demonstration. It's just that murder is truer in that sense, and that's the kind of historical situation that we're stuck with. It's a false one. It's what he calls elsewhere a kind of real illusion. So that was what I wanted to point to. One might want to say that the objectionable nature in some senses of those aphorisms isn't really his. It's the world's in that sense.
Thank you. So if there's no more questions, thank you very much, Ross, and everybody.
Thank you.